Yeah, it's funny when I've taught Nick Bostrom's arguments for the simulation hypothesis, and I pitch it as like, here's this wild harebrained idea, this is going to blow your mind, and some of the students receive it and they're like, yeah, that's probably how it is. It's like,
Yeah.
You shouldn't respond in that kind of way.
I love that.
Yep.
Well, so maybe we should say for those, I mean, if they listen to my podcast, they're going to know a little bit about it because I talk about it a lot. But what do you take the simulation hypothesis to be?
Yeah, so the simulation hypothesis would just be the hypothesis that we, or at least I, you could put it in the first person case, but let's say we are we live in a computer simulation. We are sims in the terminology that's sometimes used. So we inhabit a virtual world that is implemented on a computer created by intelligent beings kind of in the next universe up.
Yeah.
So the thought is we don't live in base reality. We live in a kind of derivative reality that exists in virtue of the running of a computer program in some like higher level, more fundamental universe.
Yeah, so good. Do you think that, does that encompass brain in a vat like theory as well?
Yeah, so I would consider that a version of the simulation hypothesis, though probably among the less plausible versions of the simulation hypothesis. So yeah, I mean, if it turns out that I exist in the next universe up with some kind of biological form with a body, or at least my brain, and then my brain is being, it's hooked up by wires to a computer that's kind of feeding it sensory input to make it seem to me as though I live in this like three-dimensional world and I'm running around in it. That would be one way of being in a computer simulation, and that's kind of the picture that you get in the Matrix. The version of the simulation hypothesis that I think philosophers take more seriously, the version that Nick Bostrom and David Chalmers usually have in mind when they talk about the hypothesis, is one where like, no, we don't. Like we and our physical embodiment exist purely in the simulated world. There's not like some physical brain of ours that exists outside the simulated world that's being fed signals. No, there's just like a simulated physical universe, and a part of that simulated universe is a simulation of a brain. And the thought is, well, if you merely simulate the behavior of like neurons in a brain, then that's going to give rise to consciousness. So it could well be that the consciousness that I experience is, one of those streams of consciousness that's generated by purely computational activity. There doesn't need to be some like biological brain existing in the next universe up.
Yeah. So that's super helpful. So in this episode, I wanted to run through some objections that I've come across that a lot of them I don't think work, but are just like, spaghetti at the wall, see what sticks. Some that I've worked on that I don't think are going to work based on my conversations with other philosophers, but we'll see. One of the objections that people raise or have raised is that the simulation hypothesis, as you just gave it, of like pure sims, that we are pure sims, that we're not, there's nothing outside of base reality or in base reality, that's us, no brain in a vat, that it's committed to like machine functionalism. And there's reasons to think machine functionalism is false, therefore simulation hypothesis is false. I wonder, first of all, are there good reasons, you think, to be a machine functionalist? And then secondly, like, it doesn't seem like simulation hypothesis is wholly committed to that theory of mind, but what do you think about that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. If you look at Bostrom's argument for taking seriously the simulation hypothesis, one of his just unargued assumptions is something close to a functionalist view of consciousness. He calls this the thesis of substrate independence, the idea that consciousness can in principle be implemented on a wide variety of different material substrates. So it doesn't need to be like organic carbon-based material substrate. It could be implemented in like silicon-based computational substrates, so long as the system has the right kind of causal organization, relevantly like our brains, it's going to give rise to conscious experiences the way that our brains do. And the way he states it is that, we don't need to reduce consciousness to like a computational state. We don't need to say that like what consciousness is just implementing a certain kind of computation. We could instead, like David Chalmers, be like less reductive about consciousness, but say that nonetheless, the causal basis of consciousness is going to be some kind of substrate independent property, some kind of high-level pattern of causal organization that can be implemented in a variety of different material substrates. So I think that's all you need in order to at least start getting some of the arguments for the simulation hypothesis off the ground. So the thought is, if you've got beings in base reality and then they program a computer to like simulate the dynamics of a brain, if you accept that having that right kind of causal organization is at least causally sufficient for generating consciousness, even if consciousness is itself not reducible to those computational patterns, then that's going to get you that, potentially you have loads and loads of conscious beings that live in computer simulations. Then the way the argument typically goes is like, well, on certain plausible assumptions, you're going to have the result that most of the conscious beings in reality live in computer simulations, or even most of the conscious beings with relevantly human-like experiences in reality live in computer simulations. And then there's going to be a kind of statistical inference from there that, okay, well, if most conscious beings are Sims, then probably we are Sims.
Yeah. He calls that like his bland indifference principle. I used to have a really big problem with that before I started studying some more epistemology, because it's like most conscious beings aren't me. Therefore, I'm not me. But I wonder, what do you make of that indifference principle? That is it necessary to get the argument going, or to finish the argument? And if so, should we attack it there, or is that like totally standard fare?
Yeah. So I think the argument, at least most versions of these arguments rely on some kind of indifference style reasoning. There's differences in exactly how to formulate the principle, and it's easy to kind of make mistakes here. So, there are indifference principles that are clearly wrong. So here's an indifference principle that might look plausible at first blush, but definitely can't be right, which is that, if most beings are F, then probably I'm F. Or, if the majority of conscious beings have a certain property, then probably I have that property. Like, that's a horrible principle.
That's good.
Because I know the majority of conscious beings live outside of South Bend. Should I conclude, therefore, probably what are the odds then that I would live in South Bend? No, okay, so that's bad. But what's going on there? Well, I have special evidence in my own case to know that, even though it's a tiny fraction of conscious beings who live in South Bend, I have kind of privileged information that I'm different, or I'm special in this particular respect. So the way Bostrom, I think, puts it is something like, if you know that like X% of conscious beings have a property F, and you don't have any further evidence that you're special with respect to this property, then your credence that you have F should be X%. Mm-hmm. So, I know that roughly 1 in 17 people have a number of hairs that's a multiple of 17. I've never counted my hairs. I don't have any evidence at all that I'm special with respect to this. So what should my confidence be that I have a number of hairs that's a multiple of 17? I claim, basically it should be like 1 in 17. Mm-hmm. Or, an example Bostrom gives, if you know that, 95% of people have a certain kind of gene that maybe doesn't express itself in any visible way, and you don't have any special evidence that you're, about whether you have the gene or whether you're special in this regard, then your confidence that you have the gene should be about 95%. That seems very, very plausible. So I'm inclined to think that if these arguments go wrong somewhere, it's not going to be in the indifference claim. Yeah. That's at least not where I would want to attack the argument.
I think that sounds right. And it depends. The claim you might want to hit on would be like the indifference principle, or sorry, the substrate independence thesis, where it's like, well, maybe there's something more biological, but it's pretty tough to get at. And also, like, if you believe in angels, it's kind of tough, because you're like, well, they don't have biological brains.
Yeah.
Presumably they're conscious, right? Like, I don't know what it mean to say that an angel's not, or there's nothing it's like to be an angel.
Yeah. I would say that angels are conscious. I think, well, there's a way of formulating the substrate independent claim that's neutral as to angelic consciousness. So,
Okay.
you could just say any take something that is conscious, like me or like you, then if there's some other being, there's some other like physical system with the same abstract causal organization as you, then that being will be conscious and indeed have the same conscious experiences as you. Mm-hmm. That's a kind of organizational invariance claim. That's a claim that Chalmers defends. That's neutral on whether there could be something radically different from you that's also conscious.
Right.
Like it's not saying that you need to have this kind of causal organization in order to be conscious, just that any two things that are exactly alike with respect to their abstract causal organization are going to be exactly alike with respect to their consciousness.
That's so good. That's a really good clarification. Yeah. So it's just saying, look at these two organizational structures. It's reasonable to assume that this one is conscious as well. It doesn't say anything about other structures that could be all wonky and crazy and or not. Okay. So that one's really good. Just to maybe to clarify it. So Bostrom's argument amongst philosophers is like, this is the one we use. Maybe I feel like Chalmers' book hasn't got a super wide audience amongst academic philosophers as it has like in the public. A lot more people reading there, or like in the tech world, a lot more people reading that. But I wonder, are you familiar enough with Chalmers' version of the argument? Can you tell us, is it significantly different in your view from Bostrom's argument?
Yeah, so I mean, it's very much a cousin of Bostrom's argument. There are going to be some differences. So Bostrom argument relies a lot on the idea of ancestor simulations, right, which are, we imagine like, well, eventually humans get to, very advanced stage of technological development where they're technologically able to run huge numbers of simulations. And in particular, he has in mind that they might want to run simulations of their ancestors, like of, their people who historically came before them. And the idea of an ancestor simulation doesn't play as big of a role in Chalmers' argument. So his thought is, so he's got this idea of I think it's something like a human-like subject or human-like conscious experience, which is any subject who has experiences with the same set of sim signs, or roughly the same balance of sim signs and non-sim signs as we find in our experience. So a sim sign is any feature of our experience that might be taken to be evidence that we are Sims. A non-Sim sign is any feature of our experience that might be taken to be evidence that we're not Sims. So an example of a Sim sign might be, well, maybe you find that you're just like a very distinguished person in the world. You find that you're the president, or you find that you're, the richest person on earth, or you find that you're some like, you run a really popular YouTube channel with lots of subscribers. And, you're really great at jujitsu, and like, okay, like you have this like privileged, distinguished position within the world you inhabit. Like, well, maybe that's more likely to be found among simulated beings, because the simulators are going to be more interested in simulating kind of like interesting lives rather than just like boring lives. Another one that Chalmers puts more weight on, or at least a fair amount of weight on, is finding yourself in the early part of the universe. He thinks like, it's very, very striking. Like our best like astronomical and cosmological estimates say that like the universe will be, hospitable to life for, I forget the exact numbers, but like, tens, hundreds of billions of years after now. We find ourselves in a very, very early period within our universes, within the period of time at which it's going to be hospitable to life. That's a little bit suspicious. He's got arguments that simulators are going to have, while most beings will exist much later in the universe's history, they're going to have interest in simulating what happened very early on, perhaps out of reasons of scientific curiosity, doing kind of like alternative counterfactual historical analysis, that sort of thing. Yeah. So those might be examples of sim signs. Examples of non-sim signs might be, well, we find ourselves in a like very richly structured, high resolution, detailed world. You might find that just for reasons of like computational efficiency, most sims would find themselves in like really low res, blocky, polygonal worlds with like without a lot of detail, and they'd be like relatively boring, simple worlds. That like our world is like incredibly rich, and when we look closely, there's all sorts of like fine grained details. Now, to some extent, that might be kind of like filled in so like maybe the simulators aren't like simulating the fine molecular details of my tea right now, but if I got the microscope out, then it would kind of ad hoc fill in
starts rendering
something plausible. And we have video games and computer games that do something like this. It's just like computational shortcuts. But it remains true that like, there's just like a lot of richness and detail and structure in the world, and you might think that's some evidence that we're not sims, because like sims it'd be more likely they'd find themselves in like low res worlds. So anyway, the thought is, a human-like subject is going to be any subject whose experiences exhibit roughly the same balance of sim signs and non-sim signs. And then if you can argue that there are probably more human-like subjects who are sims than there are human-like subjects who are non-sims, then this is where the indifference principle comes in. Probably you are a sim. And so the conclusion of Chalmers' argument, it's actually a little bit different from the conclusion of Bostrom's argument. The conclusion of Chalmers' argument, if I recall correctly, is something like, with very high probability, either there are sim blockers or we ourselves are sims. A sim blocker is defined as just like any factor that would prevent human-like subjects from creating sims, or maybe would prevent us from creating lots of sims. So one key example of a sim blocker might be, well, maybe consciousness isn't substrate independent, and that's one that I think we should put some weight on that, because the substrate independence claim, it's not crazy, but it's also not obvious. I don't think we have much positive evidence that consciousness is substrate independent. So if you want to avoid the simulation hypothesis, or avoid giving it even like modestly high credence, one way to go is to just have like an extremely low credence in substrate independence. Say like with near certainty, consciousness really requires the right kind of material substrate. So merely duplicating the abstract structure of our processing in a computer would not reproduce consciousness. So that I see as like one promising line for responding to these arguments that like probably we are sims.
Well, do you think that a belief in continuation of disembodied state, like if you survive the death of your body, does that lend credence to the substrate independence thesis? Because you're not. It seems to me like the substrate doesn't matter so much, because you can still be constituted, or your soul can be like you can still perhaps have even conscious experience outside of the substrate that you either grew in or were associated with, without outside your brain. So I don't know, what do you make of that? Yeah.
So if you think that you can, or maybe like will after death, have a kind of period of disembodied existence, I'm friendly to that idea. That gives you one sense in which consciousness is substrate independent. It like does not strictly require that there be any material substrate at all. You could still have a conscious existence without any material substrate. I think that's a somewhat different kind of substrate independence than the kind that you need to run the simulation argument. So, I mean, the key substrate independence claim that figures in the simulation arguments is not just that, in principle, it's possible to have consciousness without any material substrate at all, but that if you duplicate, like basically, if you run a simulation of my brain, you will thereby get consciousness.
Yeah.
And the idea that I'm going to exist as a disembodied soul after death, I think, doesn't lend any support to the idea that if you simulate my brain, you will thereby produce consciousness of the kind that I actually enjoy. I think those are very different claims. They don't have too much to do with one another, accepting one doesn't really lend support to the other claim. It seems to me.
Good. That's helpful. I love that point about, I think Chalmers brought this up in talking about Nozick's experience machine, where he's like, Nozick was really a famous, handsome philosopher. He should have asked himself, And then you go with Chalmers, and you're like, well, you're,
Yeah.
world famous philosopher. For a philosopher, that's a pretty big deal because no one really listens to philosophers all that much, as much as they did listen to him. So it's like, yeah, maybe you should consider yourself, which is it's really fun when it hits back on you. The more interesting life you have, the more probable it is that you live in a computer simulation.
Yeah, that's at least, I think that's a natural thought. I mean, I think relevant here is Elon Musk has said somewhere that he thinks it's like 99% certain or something that we live in a computer simulation. I think his arguments for that don't rely on the fact that he has a very distinguished role in our world, but he does, and I wonder what kind of role that plays in his psychology.
Yeah.